You're listening to the No Schedule Man podcast with Kevin Bulmer, exploring real stories and lessons learned with a variety of special guests. To learn more about Kevin and to access other episodes of the podcast, please visit noscheduleman.com and connect and contribute at No Schedule Man on Twitter or Instagram and on Facebook, YouTube, and SoundCloud, all /No Schedule Man. Thanks for listening and enjoy the No Schedule Man podcast.
I've been known to struggle with reality, not that it is any real mystery.
The question today is, who are you? Do you know who you really are? And if so, are you living from that each day or just playing a role? Or perhaps if you're like today's guest, you might be able to actually do both. A self-described student of transformation, Andre Radmall is a registered psychotherapist and life coach based in London, England. He's got over 2 decades experience working for the Priory Hospital, London School of Theology, and in private practice. Andre is also an international speaker and trainer who combines his drama and therapy experience to offer a unique approach to business consulting, and he gives us some terrific examples of this during our discussion, which is coming up in just a couple of minutes. Andre is also the author of the books Insight into Addiction and Holistic Health. Now, Andre has a unique approach to what he does. Over the years, he realized that one big reason for people getting stuck in habits like addiction, stress, or eating disorders was the way they saw themselves. He came to see that people are much more likely to fall into those kinds of habits when they don't know who they are. When people start to see themselves more clearly, he found, they start to change the story about who they are and what they can do. This is a change that can transform people emotionally, behaviorally, cognitively, and spiritually. Andre describes this change as rewriting the book of our lives. I have experienced this firsthand and believe that Andre is absolutely bang on, and he's a lot more qualified to have the opinion than I am. I can tell you, though, my imagination came alive as I spoke to Andre. What he shared both made perfect sense and struck me as something I'd never quite heard in the same way before. I was really interested in some of Andre's observations about some universal ideas and principles of self-discovery, performance, and music, and I thought about them for quite a while even after our discussion had concluded. His way of using theater to help people step both out of and into themselves, I think, is really inspired. It's really, really neat. And I think you're going to enjoy this discussion. Some of the key things that I took from my time with Andre Radmall included, number 1, the power of a name. The power meaning both good and, in some cases, not as good. He tells a story about going from the name William to Andre and the why behind it. I found it very powerful. I've been wondering what other names, labels, ideas, or stories we're putting on ourselves to define our sense of worth, but that don't really describe who we really are. You could also refer to these as personas, labels, titles. But your name doesn't necessarily indicate who you are, although in the case of Andre, that's part of why he switched it. Listen for that. It comes fairly early in the discussion. Number 2, going from monologue to a dialogue. I love this. Andre suggests that a monologue takes its toll on the imagination and therefore can be really, really limiting to your view of the world and yourself. Monologues see people trapped in a perspective and really not open to change. Dialogues, on the other hand, completely different. They're like a dance. So many other possibilities open up to you if you're open to a dialogue as opposed to being rigid about being stuck in a monologue. And number 3, letting go to receive. It's one of the many paradoxical concepts that Andre and I discuss in this conversation. He describes his transformational shift in theater when he learned to relax and let go. He said that he was, quote, taking his eyes off of me, meaning himself. Basically, he had to step out of himself in order to be fully present. Paradoxical? Perhaps. But listen for how Andre describes that, and there are several different kind of paradoxical things that come up in this conversation, which is one of the reasons why I enjoyed it so much. We also talked about performance as an act of vulnerability and service. This was really interesting to me. I would acknowledge what Andre shares in that many performers are actually introverts. And while some may have a big ego, of course, many others find it to be an incredible act of bravery to put themselves out there to share. And Andre's nod toward viewing it as a service is very interesting. So some people that may be by their very nature introverted but creative as part of that, and willing to step onto stage in whatever capacity or put themselves out there to show their creativity, is something that can induce a lot of fear for people who are, well, introverted and probably extroverted as well. But Andre has a unique perspective, at least from what I've ever heard, about viewing that as an act of service to others. I thought it was fantastic. I really think you're going to enjoy listening to Andre tell his story. Here's the conversation exploring the journey of Andre Radmall on the No Schedule Man podcast. Andre, if I were to ask you how you would describe who you are, not so much specifically in terms of what you do, but who Andre Radmall is, what would you say?
So I would say that Andre Radmall is a person who is really a student of transformation and how change works, whether it's with individuals, groups, or organizations. And in one way or another, I think everything I've ever done has been something to do with change. Whether it's been as an actor, whether it's been as a business coach, whether it's been as a therapist, whether it's been as a systemic couples therapist. It's really all about the process of change and what the conditions are in which change can take place. So I'm all about transformation and change, really.
How did the curiosity of investigating change and then ultimately wanting to help people with that begin to manifest itself for you?
Well, it's really interesting. I mean, I think it really goes back to my sort of origin story, which in a nutshell is that, is it okay if I tell you like the story of my name? Because that would probably kind of pinpoint this a bit.
I would love you to tell whatever story that you want for however long you want, Andre. Please do.
Okay, so I was adopted when I was about a week old, and I grew up in an adoptive family, and I didn't know until I was maybe in my 30s that originally I had another name. My birth mother had given me another name. So I'd grown up with this name, which was actually William. And everyone called me Bill, which is short, of course, for William, and didn't think anything of it. And then my dad, my father, gave me this bit of paper, which was an original birth certificate. And it had this original name on. And I thought, that name is amazing. I love Andre. That's such a cool name. I would rather be called Andre. It seems more creative, artistic, and so on. So I after a bit of time thinking about it, I changed my name officially, which was not difficult. And that probably sort of sums up, in a way, this interest I've got with shifting out of one identity into another. Now, that was just a name, although a name, of course, is very significant and very important for how we think of who we are in our identities. But I guess that was not so far away from what I was doing as an actor when I was shifting into different roles, playing different identities on stage or on film. And I, as a person who was interested in psychology and how people kind of can get out of difficult places and change their stories, I think that started when I was probably pretty young, so maybe 18, 19. And I got really interested in helping people to change the stories they'd got trapped in and stuck in. And that's carried on essentially until today.
What age were you when you made the decision to change your name?
So I changed my name when I was about, where are we now? About 42, yeah. So it's quite late in the game, really.
So you were William or Bill for the first 4 decades of your life.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask this another way. What age were you then, Andre, approximately, when you discovered the name Andre and then had that realization that you just described for us?
I guess I was being around about 38, 39, that kind of region.
Wow.
So there's a few years delay before I decided to go for it and change the name.
I'm glad I asked, because my interpretation of that was, and I might have missed something that you said, but I took that as meaning that you did that fairly early on, like as a younger person. But that's interesting that your interest was piqued in these ideas of change and transformation in your late teens, and then it was a couple decades after that you actually put another name and role. I'm fascinated by that whole idea of even identifying roles and names, because really, although it can be a powerful influencer over our mindset, a name really is just another form of a label, isn't it?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think I realized that when I changed my name, I guess I thought maybe this will change my identity or something. I wasn't sure what it would do, really. But of course, it's just a name, and so you're still essentially the same person. You have the same ways of thinking, the same ways of doing things. And that's why I guess I'm also interested in these other kind of methods, particularly around therapy or using drama to help people and myself actually shift out of one identity and into something else, just to expand the range, really.
You've mentioned a few different interests and passions already, Andre, including acting, business coaching, therapy, working with some couples. Let's go back and explore a little bit further in your teenage years, or even whatever time around that, or even before that you like. What were some of the things that interested you? And I have a guess in terms of what you're going to say. I want to see if I'm right or not. But what were some of the things that you were interested in at that time that you felt like were going to be part of your story going forward?
Well, I was very interested in different forms of performance. I was in a band and wrote songs, and probably thought when I was 17 I'd be a rock star, that kind of thing. But it was probably around about that time as well when I started getting into acting. And that really, really kind of opened up a whole new world for me. I found that very liberating, very exciting. Other things I was interested in at the time were actually things like American comics, and I was very interested in superheroes, and of course that's very often about transformation as well. And I was interested in, because I went into work, my first job was as a mental health nurse, and I was really interested there in how people had got into the kind of situations where they were in a mental health hospital, but also how they would get out of that situation as well. And I guess that's been a very long-standing fascination.
I'd like to talk about the acting more specifically for a moment. You touched on how, I'm trying to remember the vocabulary that you used, but interested you were and intriguing that you found that with looking into the different roles. Can you take me a little bit deeper into what your attraction into theater and acting was?
Yeah, I mean, I was pretty young when I started to act in a amateur theatre company. I guess I came from a fairly conservative background, quite constricted in a lot of ways. My parents did their best, but it was a fairly, what would be the word, a little bit old-fashioned, quite rule-bound kind of background. And suddenly I found myself in this situation where I could be somebody else. I could expand my horizons tremendously. And that was a great release and a great relief. And I've talked to actors over the years, and quite often well, some actors are a little bit like I was, perhaps a bit introverted, and then find this marvelous release of being able to be someone else. Of course, I learned as the years went by that it wasn't really so much that I was being someone else, it was that I was releasing something else from within me that was already there. And acting a role just enabled me to release that, because all I really was doing was being myself, but just another version of myself.
I think that's really interesting and important, because as you were talking about that, I'm listening to you, Andre, and I'm thinking he is skating a really thin razor's edge here between hanging his sense of self and who you are, where we started, on another persona, another role, another label, and the release and expression of who you are through playing that role. I'm curious how it was that you began to realize what you just described, that this wasn't really who you are, but it was a way of releasing to get you more back in touch with who that was. How did you recognize that?
Yeah, that's a very good, interesting question. I think that I remember there was a really significant shift came for me when I actually had gone through drama school and started working as a professional actor, which would have been in my sort of late 20s. And I think what I'd been doing up till then, I'm not sure if this answers the question, so let me know if it doesn't. But what I was doing up until then was essentially trying to just do what I was told to do by the director, by what the words said on the paper, and, you know, as they say, you know, remember my lines and not bump into the furniture. And you know, and I managed to do that pretty well, I suppose. But there was one show that I was in, and I was reading a book by a famous acting coach called Stanislavski, and the thing that jumped out from it was to just relax and start listening to other people on stage, other actors. And when I stopped trying to be the role and to do the role properly and just relaxed, let it go, and just started to respond to what was going on around me and other people, the role really came alive, and I came alive. And it wasn't me being the role as such, it was me being myself. And I found that quite an interesting shift, actually, in my work in therapy as well. Is it seems that sometimes taking my eyes off me and worrying about what I'm doing and entering into this kind of dance, really, of responding to what other people are doing and listening and being awake, really, to my circumstances, it was very freeing, and it released something true and honest in me.
I just love everything you just shared, and the idea of being awake. The word that was in my mind listening to you, Andre, was awareness. And as you were sharing that, I'm thinking, I want to ask him how the Andre Radmall that is talking to me here today in 2017, knowing what he knows through all of the years of the experience with all of the different things that you've been doing and realizing and the journeys that you've been exploring, including your own, and no doubt the awareness that you've developed. How would you look back at that guy that was in his 20s that had that experience? What do you think, reflecting back, was his actual level of self-awareness at that time compared to how you are now?
I hope it's better now than it was then. Yeah, I mean, I think that moment I've just described was a turning point in some ways. I think that guy who was worried about getting it right and conforming to other people's expectations was kind of not so awake, really, to himself or to the world around him. He was more preoccupied with getting it right and probably getting approval from other people in the process as well. I think where I'm at now is I hope that I can simply improvise more with people around me and not just kind of join the dots and be mechanical, but really stay in the moment to moment living with people who are speaking with me or I'm interacting with, whether it's in work or out of work. That seems to me to be the biggest difference now to where I was back then. A kind of greater flow, greater sense of flow, greater sense of movement, probably more vulnerability as well, because I'm not kind of running the show so much. I'm a participant rather than the kind of master and controller. So yeah, those are some of the differences.
You described the process and the significance of being able to just relax and let it go as it relates to your theatrical pursuits. I'm curious about how, if at all, that was able to show itself in the rest of what was going on in your life at the time and in the time immediately following that.
Well, I would like to say it did, but I think that I was still fairly locked down in a lot of my life around that time. But I think as the years have gone on, I've gradually, more and more become that person in my everyday life. But it took a while. It took a while because I think there's something quite profound about going on stage and then coming off stage. That off stage life is really rather different and it felt to me like there was less permission to be free in that particular way in my everyday life. So I think it's been a bit of an ongoing process, that one. I don't think it made a huge difference at the time, other than probably makes more difference now, actually, looking back on it, that I can draw on that experience and use that as a kind of something to orientate myself to, because it was profound.
How then did you begin to transition from acting, which it sounds like was occupying a lot of your time? Maybe I'm hearing it incorrectly.
No, that's right.
How did the transition then, Andre, happen of that into more of who I might view you as now in terms of coach and the therapy and speaking and all of those kinds of things?
Yeah. Well, I mean, some of it was quite practical, that I just wasn't making enough money. It was not paying the bill. It wasn't paying the bills. I was working in fringe theatre in London quite a bit, and it just wasn't paying the bills. And I was married, and I had kids on the way, and just needed to get a job which would pay better, really. So that was quite a bit of it when I decided to step back from acting, which I did when I was like 30, 31. And then I went back into working in the field of mental health, actually, for a while in a mental health day centre, and started to train as a drama therapist. Did a master's degree in drama therapy around that time, and used that in the day centre that I was working in. So I was actually facilitating groups where clients could then experience this for themselves, experience a shift out of their normal restricted roles and try something different. And that really evolved over the years into me eventually going into private practice, training as a psychotherapist. And it was really, about 5 years ago when I kind of dipped my toe back in the water of the theatre again and put a show on, wrote a show, put a show on, acted in it. And I've done a few short films since, but the coaching, I suppose, has kind of evolved really as one of the more recent developments in terms of being really interested again in helping people to break out of the boxes that they've got stuck in, that sometimes they've been put in by other people, and I find drama and improv and storytelling really helpful in doing that.
What are some of the experiences that you've had without naming names or specific circumstances, but some of the experiences that immediately come to mind, Andre, of working with people where you've seen and maybe even helped facilitate transformations in people that have been particularly profound for you.
Yeah. So I remember working with, doing a consultation with an IT company a few years ago, and they were kind of these guys. There's probably about 5 of these guys that I was working with. They probably saw themselves as technicians and no more than that. And we did some drama improv exercises with them where they played with the idea of status. So they would play with being higher status or lower status, and they found it easier to be lower status. But 1 or 2 of these guys, when they played high status, suddenly realized, oh, wow, I can actually do this. And they'd never really been high status. They were kind of like just doing their job every day, sort of doing code probably. And suddenly they started to wonder if they should go on the leadership track in this company, because they could see something in themselves, and the group there could witness it and affirm it, that they had the capacity to lead, and they had the ability to influence and make a difference that they hadn't even been aware of before, really. And so these 2 guys went on to do some individual coaching with me, which was all around leadership development, and they managed to move up in the company into really significant and influential roles, which I don't think they would have ever considered if they hadn't have come into this improv drama therapy drama session. So that was really, really rewarding.
You're actually then asking people to step outside themselves. I'm thinking about the different corporate and work environments that I've been a part of, Andre, and the phrase that immediately comes to mind is role playing, and everybody cringes.
Oh,
and I actually enjoy doing that, but because I always feel like I'm learning something. But so the 2 things that I'm thinking I'm listening to that is, number 1, of how inspired that is and brilliant to be able to use as a tool, and also a way to bring the authentic Andre Radmall into that process. But I'm also wondering what, if any, resistances you maybe get, especially in an organizational setting, when you ask people to take on different roles like that.
Well, this is where I think it's really important to warm up to it, because I mean, in that situation, I did a series of warm-ups. I think I spent a whole morning, actually, just doing kind of imagination exercises, so that people didn't have to move their bodies around particularly or be somebody else. They just played around with passing a pen around and pretending it was different objects, that kind of game, using the imagination. When I've introduced this kind of role play, sort of improv idea into groups with less warm-up, I'm usually met with shock, horror, fear, anxiety, people wanting to run out of the room. It's not good, usually. It's not good, because there's just this fear of performance, because I think people generally equate it with having to be on stage and performing, which means you've got to be amazing, and you've got to be entertaining, and you've got all these pressures that you've got to fulfill, and it just makes people close down terribly. So I spend quite a bit of time on helping people build up their confidence in just imagining different things and playing around with maybe images, looking at different postcards with different images on and seeing what they associate with those images. All of this kind of warms the heart and mind up, I think, to be able to step out with a bit more confidence into doing something different.
I wonder how much of that initial anxiety, Andre, also comes from some place of not, I don't mean to generalize here, but not even really necessarily knowing or being in touch with who you are, or more to the point, being comfortable with showing that to other people, let alone yourselves. In other words, not wanting to sort of be exposed and go out on a limb. It almost sounds as if introducing the role is almost kind of a bridge from where you are to opening up to kind of embrace your authenticity. Do you see what I mean?
Yes, I do. That's certainly the way I understand it. But that you're right, the initial sort of reaction to even do something very sort of simple that's a bit different, like, even asking for help or complaining. I mean, you're probably aware, this is generalizing massively, but English people find it a bit difficult to complain sometimes. And so even going up to someone and saying, I'm not happy with this item is not easy. It's uncomfortable because I guess people kind of stay within the zone of what they're comfortable as being, but also some of that is hiding and keeping back some areas of their lives which they don't want other people to see. Maybe they feel ashamed of something, or maybe they feel other people have told them things that they're not good at, so they kind of hold those things back. All sorts of areas I find in people's lives where they've essentially put them into a box and they're sitting on the box and hoping nobody can see that there's a box there. That's quite common, actually. So I think, yes, role play, I don't use the term role play, I suppose, but improvisation and doing something with characters and scripts even, where people can... It's really helpful, actually, to have a script for this because it gives people something to hang on to, where they can say some words that have been given to them and take some actions. And I think action is a really important thing in this, to physically move, that are not their own actions and not their own words. I think it does release them and open up a bridge from the kind of almost the shame-based identity, which often people have, into something which is prepared to disclose, prepared to open up, and prepared to give to those that are there. And I think role and making believe, the as-if sort of reality, all of that kind of just makes it a little bit easier to do that.
The more I'm hearing about this, the more I'm excited about it and would love to participate and see something like this happen. You used the word complain when you offered the generalization of the people in your country generally not liking to complain. Canadians have been largely painted with the same brush.
Okay.
But the word that's coming to my mind is asking. And in fact, I'm reading one of Jack Canfield's books right now, Andre, about asking. Because one of the things that I've realized in my own journey is that, and I don't even know where it came from. I don't remember anybody specifically saying this to me. It was just an idea and a belief that I acquired. But that asking for help was either weakness, it was a sign that you weren't resourceful enough to figure it out, or it was selfish. And so not even so much of the complaint, but just reaching out. And this is something I see manifest in the workplace, certainly in relationships and friendships and parenting arrangements. Is then the next thing is we just jump to assumption because we're not, I think you see where I'm going here, but we're not asked, not even necessarily complaining, but then we just go around wondering what each other is thinking when we're not even really sure what we're thinking. It's an awful mess, isn't it?
It's an awful mess. Yeah. I mean, the problem with that is that people end up isolated from each other because they don't know what the other person's thinking. They're not going to tell them what they're thinking. And there's a lot of fear around. And so, I definitely have seen that in a more corporate kind of business environment, because you've also got the added element of competition sometimes too, where people don't want to be vulnerable because then other people might take advantage of that and kind of get ahead of them. So I think that is a really common kind of situation in work, out of work, in relationships. I definitely see that in relationships too, where perhaps each person in the relationship has been hurt by something in the past, and they've made a kind of resolution to themselves that they're not going to go there again. They're not going to be vulnerable again. They're not going to open themselves up like that again. because it might go wrong again. And then, of course, what happens is they kind of pull the drawbridge up, or they pull the shutters down, to use another metaphor, and sort of separate themselves from each other in a way that makes it hard to communicate. And the way this usually manifests itself, this kind of isolation to avoid pain, is when people just fail to communicate and misunderstand each other. So, yeah, it's a kind of chain reaction process that I think starts with a kind of fear of vulnerability and ends up in isolation and communication issues.
One of the things that I noted from some of the material on your website, Andre, was a sentence that indicated that part of the approach that you like to take is the idea of moving from monologue to dialogue.
Absolutely.
And I've got that in mind as we're just discussing this, that whether you're asking or whether you're assuming, whether you're sinking back into yourself and wondering and not, as you say, you've got those shutters pulled down to the drawbridge up, you're creating more and more of a monologue, aren't you? And not really doing anything to address or heal whatever the external circumstances are. And I'm wondering if that, because I know you do some work with people that are in the throes of addiction as well, and once you start sinking into that monologue, it can have some pretty dire consequences, I imagine.
Yeah, well, I came up with this idea of monologue and dialogue when I was, particularly actually when I was working with people with eating disorders, but it really holds true of addiction as well, with addiction and lots of other things, which is, for me, a monologue is when somebody gets trapped inside their own perspective on life, when they only can sort of see things from their point of view. And unfortunately, they're often repeating a kind of narrative to themselves that's quite negative as well about themselves, and maybe about the world, and maybe about other people. And these, I call them monologues because they're not really open to change. And they don't involve anyone else, and they tend to repeat over and over again. And I've certainly spoken to people over the years who have got really stuck in monologues that really were put on them by their parents or by school or by other people, and they never question them. So for them, those monologues are utter truth. And of course, an addiction or an eating disorder is really just a way of coping with an unbearable monologue, because it's just too difficult and painful to live with that ongoing story that never gets better. But where I love the idea of dialogue, because for me it's like a dance, really. It's kind of coming out of that space, becoming more vulnerable, but then entering into the space of other people, hearing their stories, entering into their world, and then being able to enter into our world. And for me, those bridges create something much more dialogic and much more robust, actually. So although it's more vulnerable, it's more robust, it's not so fragile. And great things can happen then. New ideas are more likely to happen, new narratives and stories and ways of going forward in the world are much more likely to happen when people can open up to each other and start moving with each other. Could go on about that, but that's the monologue dialogue thing for me.
There's a really interesting irony, I think, Andre, in some of the themes that we've explored over the last few minutes about the monologue and about being willing to ask and explore and not wanting to appear, I'll say selfish for lack of a much better word, but I'm going to trust that you know what I'm reaching for here.
Oh, yeah.
Whereas the magic is that when you enter one of those dialogues and you do ask and you open up that dance with the other person, it has this magical way, in my experience, of drawing them closer to you, because it becomes not even so much about you, but when you open up a space for them to share who and what they are with you and create a safe space for that. I don't feel like I'm describing this very well, but I feel like you'll know what I'm getting at or trying to. Do you?
Yeah, I think I get it. I think that it's kind of paradoxical in a way that I think when people are stuck in their kind of monologue with the drawbridge up and the shutters down, that they fear that if they opened themselves up to the other person would destroy them or attack them, or it would be bad. And yet it's exactly the opposite. Usually, if it's a safe person, it's exactly the opposite. That in fact, the person who's been stuck in this sort of wheel going round and round for a long time suddenly finds that they're known and that they're accepted, and the other person actually can really understand them. And it's a big shift, and a really positive shift, to be understood and heard, maybe for the first time in some cases. It's very freeing.
I suppose I feel, Andre, like, suppose I were having an issue and I approached you, and even though I'm the one that wants to set myself free of these anxieties that I'm carrying around with me from whatever the case might be, and I may feel selfish and have reservations about approaching you on it in any fashion, but if I were to just open up enough to ask you, what are your feelings on this? Or how does this look from where you are? Or what would you say about this situation? The irony is I've now handed that over to where it's not about me. I've given that to you, and you probably will light up, because now I've honored you, in a way of speaking, by asking, not telling you, not broadcasting to you, but being open more to receive your view and perspective of the situation.
Yeah, that's a very different, much more dialogic perspective than these kind of boxes that people get rather trapped in. And each person can free the other person up, and it's a sort of virtuous circle. It just gets better and better. And in that scenario, yes, it would open me up to feel, really able to contribute and participate. And it's not as if one person's doing something to the other person in a kind of binary way. I think it's more like some third thing happens out of the dialogue and out of the conversation, which is kind of almost bigger than each person individually.
Andre, along this journey and the different paths and the way that it's manifested, what immediately comes to mind as something that was particularly challenging for you?
Challenging for me? Well, I think one of the things that's always challenging for me is when I'm working with people and they don't change, because I have this kind of strong narrative about change and transformation. And this hasn't bothered me so much in recent years, because I kind of look at it a bit differently. But in the past, I can certainly remember lots of times when I've thought, well, I'm doing everything I can think of here. I'm talking to this person, or working with this group, and actually nothing seems to be changing. And that was pretty frustrating, and I think that's one of the frustrations that counsellors or therapists often have, is that they put a lot of work in and don't always see change. How I dealt with that was that I let go of my expectation that the other person had to change, and I just started getting curious about what was actually going on with them, and maybe the stories they were telling made sense to them and had a reason. And really, I just needed to listen and understand where people were coming from and how they'd come to the conclusions they were coming to, because I wasn't getting anywhere by just trying to change it. And that's actually been quite a powerful intervention I found over the years of to help people to really just know that they're being listened to, and more than that, though, that I'm understanding the reasons why they've come to the position they're in, why they think the way they do about themselves or the world, and that makes sense. It's not illogical or crazy. It's actually valid. And funnily enough, it's when people kind of know that that's been heard and understood that change seems to happen automatically, because it's almost like they're free enough then to let go of that thing because it's been heard, it's been understood, and then they can try something new maybe. But for some time that was certainly a frustration.
I wonder if some of the folks that are just so entrenched in a maniacal monologue may be that way in some parts because they feel that they haven't been heard or can't be.
Yeah, I think that's often the case, is that people repeat the same story until somebody hears it. Unfortunately, it's often just going on in their own internal world, so it's kind of difficult for people to understand it or hear it properly. But yeah, a lot of times people have a lot of things to say, a lot of feelings, and yet nobody's really ever picked it up. Nobody's ever made space for it.
Tell me a little bit about speaking. Because I'm thinking that with your drama background, there seems to be a natural inclination toward the stage, but being, one-on-one with a person in personal coaching, or being in an environment with a team and an organization, a very intimate setting, much different than, in some respects, I suppose, Andre, than being on stage in front of a group of people and trying to summarize some of these thoughts and make them universal enough to share so that each person may take that through their own perspective. But take me through the part of what speaking you do and how that weaved itself into your experience.
Okay, so I guess some of the speaking I do has come out of training and teaching, because some of my background is in, for example, training therapists in their training, and I think that's where my speaking probably started to take off, actually, is when I was employed for a few years to train counsellors at a university. And I realised I really liked it, which shouldn't really have been a surprise, because I'd always liked being on stage and kind of speaking to groups of people. And then I kind of, really as part of that, I started doing workshops in the UK, but also in other places around the world, on topics like eating disorders or addiction or change management. And I did find, even speaking to sort of smaller groups of people, that I was using similar skills. It felt quite sort of familiar, similar skills of projection and trying to be sort of easily understood and inspiring, maybe. I think that's always been a big part of what I've tried to do, and I've been working even with professionals. So I've worked with psychologists in Kuwait, I've worked with counselling students in Singapore and various other places. And mainly I think I'm just trying to inspire people. And I guess one of the threads that runs through this is storytelling. That's one of the big facets of me speaking to these groups, is that I'm telling stories so that they can kind of relate to the ideas and the material through the stories that I'm telling. So yeah, that's kind of how it developed. It really developed out of teaching into doing workshops and then into sort of speaking engagements. How much of that do you still do? Well, I do it from time to time, and I'm actually wanting to do it more. So I'm generating some new material at the moment, writing a book that I'm hoping will be out in the next year. And I want to sort of use that as a basis to do more speaking engagements in the UK, but also abroad. And I want to, I want to do more of it, actually. I haven't done so much recently, and I'd like to do more. I'm imagining that it must be interesting and really rewarding for you to be able to get into other areas. You mentioned about the counseling students in Singapore, and experience other cultures, and also see how some of these ideas about, the monologue versus the dialogue, and not necessarily really understanding who you are, or even realizing that that's a journey that you can take, being, and I'm just guessing here, Andre, you've traveled more than I have, but being somewhat universal across cultures. What's that feel like? Yeah, so far I would say that has been universal across cultures. It may kind of look a little bit different in, say, Southeast Asia to how it would look here, but it is a kind of fairly consistent sort of thing that people seem to get stuck in a monologue. Sometimes I do wonder if whole groups, organisations, or I don't know, maybe even countries, I'm not sure how far out it goes, can get quite stuck in a monologue, which is perpetuated by things like the media or social media. And I think my job is to sort of be somewhat of a disruptor to that, to open up more possibilities, at least, for ways of seeing things. That may sometimes be countercultural, but I mean, one of the things I picked up in Singapore is that it's really interesting because there is this kind of mixture of, I guess, American culture and Southeast Asian culture, and it's kind of mixed up together. So there are already almost sort of different ways of being just within the place. So shifting between these kind of different positions or different identities is already kind of happening in this multicultural world.
Andre, what would you say is the difference between being stuck in a monologue and actually understanding and embracing who you are?
Well, okay, so I think that being stuck in a monologue the monologue usually is not anything to do with who you really are, or it may just be a sort of version of who you are, and a limited version of that. Coming out of that, was that the second part of the question? How do you come out of that?
Well, just the idea, what I'm trying to set up here is I think that one maybe leads to the other, that it's a process, but from recognizing that you might have your own monologue, but then that next stage toward really being able to investigate and start to understand who it is that you actually are.
Yeah, okay, so for me, this happens probably in stages, but in my experience, the first stage of that is when people realize that they're in a monologue. Just that realization that these thoughts that they thought were them and these ideas and feelings that they've always assumed were just the truth and the way the world is are actually just a monologue. They're just one version of reality. And I think the first thing really is when people start to see that this is not necessarily the only way to see things. That shift alone, I always think, is like the hinge on a door that can start to open, which is the shift of perspective. I don't think any change can happen anywhere unless there's been a shift of position. And then from a different position, a person can look at things from a different angle, a different point of view. And that's really the sort of first step towards opening up a different way of living. I think other things that come into that, just to chuck a few things into the melting pot here, are visualization. I think is pretty helpful because when people have got stuck in one way of seeing things, their imagination has also got kind of stuck as well. So if they can kind of imagine even a day in their life looking a bit different, with them maybe doing some different things, doesn't even have to be massively kind of radically different. But if they can imagine some shifts, some little changes that they could make, then it'll be that much easier for them to put those things into practice. And once that happens, confidence starts to build up that some more changes could be made, and that there are possibilities that they had not thought were even there before starting to open up. So I think it's probably incremental. I think I'm just thinking as I'm describing it, it feels kind of like an incremental step-by-step change rather than a sort of huge revelatory sort of moment.
Well, I think that's important because so many of us, in whatever it might be, are looking for, either the immediate solution or the fix in 5 easy steps, as opposed to being willing to embark upon a journey that reveals itself a stage at a time.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I think we do live in that kind of culture which is looking for the quick fix. And I certainly get that when I get, some clients are looking for quick fixes. But in my experience, the quick fix usually fails pretty quickly as well.
That's interesting. And it goes back to where we were at the start of the conversation, where you had that shift where you realized you were able to kind of get out of yourself and relax and let go.
Yeah.
Which, isn't that an interesting irony, Andre, that when you're willing to let go of something, it actually, in a way, allows you to be more attached isn't the right word, but present and engaged in it and grateful for it, which in turn makes that journey of transformation all the more easy and enjoyable to embark upon.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's kind of paradoxical and it's a little bit countercultural sometimes, but I think it is a case for letting go to really receive it fully. Better to let go of the small thing if we get to be receiving the big thing as a result.
Okay, so now before I let you go, I want to have a little fun. Back about 45 minutes ago, you mentioned to me about music and being in a band and wanting to be a rock star, but that hasn't come back up again yet. Are there still any musical inclinations kicking around in your spirit somewhere?
Well, I do. Yeah, I mean, I like to play guitar, and I like singing, and I love music. I love listening to music. I guess what happened with that was it kind of morphed into performance, and I still am a performer. I'm absolutely not ashamed to say it. I really am someone who pretty much thrives in that environment. But I'm a bit of an introvert as well, so I have to watch the energy levels, and I kind of replace the energy when I've been doing stuff. But yeah, I think still love music. I don't know if I'll be in a band again, but hey, who's to say? Maybe I will. I'm open to it.
There's so many expressions of what are parts of you I'm feeling, Andre, that have such universal appeal. Some of the principles that we've talked about across cultures, performance and theater, music, of course, it continues to astound me how certain artists can be just received with enormous amounts of love and adoration in cultures that can't even understand what the singer is singing in some cases, and yet the message and the emotion can still get across. And I wonder if that's maybe and perhaps I'm flying around the room too much here and making too much of it, but when you come from that place of creativity and authenticity, and if you can allow yourself, here's something else I think is a little bit paradoxical, Andre, is that, that if you're going to get up on stage or perform, or you're, on one hand, it looks like you're really asking for people's attention and you're confident enough that you're going to broadcast out, when in fact, those that have done it will understand that there are a lot of introverts in that, and that it's an incredible act of vulnerability.
Oh, yeah.
To put yourself out there. And I wonder if all of that plays into maybe kind of creating this universal connection and that sort of authentic creativity.
Yeah, I mean, I think going back to when I started out with acting, I guess I was looking for the approval. I was looking for the affirmation that came with it. And in some respects, it was more about me than it was about anything else, and my ego. However, I now believe that at its best, things like performance or acting and speaking in front of people is a massive act of vulnerability. But I think it's also pretty much an act of service as well, that, to open oneself up to people in that way, not for sort of ego's sake, but more for the sake of helping them to open up as well. Because there's that kind of interesting process goes on in an audience, which is that they kind of identify with the person on stage, and if the person on stage is being authentic, true and vulnerable, I just think it kind of makes it easier for the audience to be authentic, true and vulnerable too.
That's a really interesting way to look at it, Andre. Thank you so much for that and for this time. what are some of the ways that people could maybe learn more about you or interact with you if they've happened upon this conversation and would like to connect further?
Okay, so people can find out more about me at my website, which is andreradmall.com, which is AndreRadmall.com. I'm also on Twitter at Radmall, capital R, ADMAL, capital A, NDRE, Radmall Andre. And that's pretty much it. Yeah, I'm on Facebook as well as Andre Radmall.
I'm so grateful to you, my new friend. It continues to astound me that when I reach out into different parts of the world, or even sometimes just up the street, and ask somebody to spend an hour of their time, which I view as your most valuable commodity, something you can never get back, but to be with me and to share parts of you for the benefit of anyone that takes the time to listen. And I'm just so grateful and really, really enjoyed this conversation, and I certainly hope that we'll have more together as things develop for us both. But thank you so much for this time, Andre, and all the best in the days to come.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I've enjoyed it.
If you'd like to connect with Andre, you can do that at his website, www.andreradmall.com. I'll spell that for you. His first name is Andre. His last name Radmall. andreradmall.com. You can also find Andre on Twitter. This time, though, you're going to have to reverse the name. His handle is @RadmallAndre. So twitter.com/Radmall, Radmall, Andre, Andre. Also look for his books on Amazon, Holistic Health and Insight to Addiction. It was terrific talking with Andre, and I wish him all the best and encourage you to reach out to him. And I hope that he and I will cross paths again at some point. I'm sure that we will. Some other episodes you might like if you enjoyed this conversation with Andre. Episode 33 with my friend Derek Botten. It's called Embracing Contentment and Letting Go. And I thought about that episode as I was speaking to Andre, just in that whole idea of letting go to receive and the theatrical and performance aspect of really finding yourself. Those are themes that run through that conversation with Derek. That's episode 33. Episode 22 with my friend Gare Maxwell. It's called Reinvention and Focusing on Possibility. Have a listen to that one. I thought about that as soon as Andre talked about the idea of going from a monologue to a dialogue, because something that Gare shared in that episode, number 22, has stuck with me ever since, where he talks about going from being stuck on transmit to receive. An inspired idea, and there are some similarities between the two. That's episode 22, I think you're really going to like. And going all the way back to episode 14, Owning Your Choices and Working Your Mental and Emotional Muscles with Sarah Westbrook. There is some performance aspect of that as well. So not only the mindset part and understanding your choices, but Sarah speaks and she writes and she's a musician and a songwriter. So there are some parallels there with what Andre had to share for sure. You can find those and all other archived episodes of the No Schedule Man podcast on iTunes or at noschedulemanpodcast.com. Please do take a moment to subscribe, share it if you like it, and leave a comment, rating, or review. I'd love to hear from you and know what you think of the show. In the meantime, you can reach me at kevinbulmer.com. noscheduleman.com will take you to the same place. All my social media channel links are up there, as is the sign up for my email list. I'd really love for you to keep in touch and do hope that you'll join me along this journey and add your voice to mine. Thank you again for taking the time to listen and to share part of your day with me. I'm grateful, and I hope to have you back with me next week as we explore another journey on the No Schedule Man podcast.
Just a little deja vu.